This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to journalist Mitchell Prothero about the prospect of conflict reigniting in the Balkan region of Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was extreme violence there in the 90s during the Balkan Wars, and now it's looking like things are getting very tense again. Mitchell's going to explain it to us. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, support us at patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support. There's been what some people are saying the most heightened tensions in Bosnia since the 90s. One of the kind of Serbian representatives wants to break away. You've been there, you've been reporting. Tell us what's going on. Is this as tense as everybody is saying? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, it's the situation right now in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it gets complicated describing all of its different parts, which is the problem. But the overall problem in post-Dayton Bosnia, the peace treaty that they came up with in the 90s that ended the civil war, there's really grave concern that it's falling apart. It was one of those, I think, and there's probably better diplomatic people to explain it, but what happened during the Civil War was essentially, as Yugoslavia was breaking up, the most multi-ethnic of the former Yugo states was Bosnia, which is, a mix of Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox Serbs. Everybody kind of went at it for territory, and, people know that history, but there was like genocide, and it was really brutal. So I think in 95, they just wanted to sort of stop it and give everybody a government of their own in an incredibly small place. And that worked for a while. But, what we're looking at now is it's a country of 4 million people. It's got one federal government on top of it that's also got three parts. The Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbs have their sections. And then when you get inside it, everything's also got three sections. So the whole place basically sort of rotted in a little bit of a level of sectarian corruption, where the only real benefits anybody had were to play off the different sectarian sides against each other. And that stopped the war initially, but it didn't really fix the overall problems. And that's really coming to a head. We're seeing a lot of very cynical politicians are now emboldened, because essentially what people told me when I was there in December, and then I spent much of January there, the consensus was that, for years the EU had strung along Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, the new countries out of the former Yugoslavia, with EU membership. And then, they finally said, okay, Bosnia, Serbia, you guys, you're not coming anytime soon. And the second that happened, a lot of the more cynical and a lot of the more corrupt politicians who know that they couldn't survive very well under a proper EU government, nobody would need them anymore. Those guys all really turned up the temperature. And the basic example we see of that is in the Republic of Srpska, which is sort of its own country of Bosnian Serbs that's part of Bosnian Federation. And on the other side, you've got actually, Bosnia with the Croats and the Muslims. So these two countries that are run by a system of three governments. So as you can see, in Banja Luka, which is the Bosnian Serb capital, Dodik has basically really raised the pressure on trying to bust out. And whether he wants full autonomy, whether he wants independence, whether he wants to be part of Serbia, it's unclear. What he definitely seems to want to do, though, is wreck Dayton and make everything as difficult as possible inside. And so that just makes everybody terrified. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but it's a brutally complicated little country.
No, that's exactly what we like on Popular Front. Very detailed. And how serious is this in terms of there's a potential for actual armed violence to take place?
Well, there's a few things. But one of the reasons why I went in December was to basically try to answer that question, because people have been saying that there's a lot of, that it's the highest tensions, and I wholeheartedly agree it's the highest level of tension since 95, but that there was this threat of a new civil war. And that gets complicated. I don't really see there being a possibility of what we saw, let's say, in the 90s, or even what we're seeing today going on in Ukraine in terms of conventional conflict, if only because Bosnia is really emptied out. It's been such kind of sort of a hopeless, peaceful, but corrupt little place full of educated people, educated young people who have access to Europe, that, you know, people under 30 still hanging out in Bosnia, you know, most of them are gone.
Right.
And so, you know, you've seen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in a small place all flee for Germany, for Austria, for the EU. It's not that hard for your average Bosniak who has a little bit of resources and a little bit of savvy to get a work permit for Schengen. And as a result, a lot of people are gone. I spent a lot of time there this winter, and those villages are empty. When you drive around, you know, the Republika Srpska side, you know, there's some people in the cities, and you see young people in the cities and stuff, but it's an old country now. And the people that are in the countryside, they're straight up old. I mean, I joke, there's nothing but like plum brandy and like domestic violence out there. Like, there's not any business. There's not like, it's just like poor old people drinking, living on farms. You don't see the guys that you would need to actually properly have a war. And the other thing is, part of what made the 90s war so brutal was that Yugoslavia had this huge Soviet-era army that had been, you know, well equipped throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s. And so all of that stuff was sitting around for people to grab to use on each other when the civil wars broke out across the former Yugoslavia. That stuff's all gone. So when we talk about the potential for violence, and I think there is some, as things deteriorate, if they do, there's going to be elections this October. And one Western diplomat told me if they make it to the elections, things might be okay. But there's a possibility for violence. It's a much smaller scale, but it's still there. And the difference would be this time it might be small groups of people instigating things, shooting each other, rather than sieges or incidents of violence or assassination and increases of organized crime. And the biggest problem with the Balkans right now is that the EU and the US are particularly distracted. If something bad were to happen, the good guys that would come to try to sort things out this time are going to be like Serbia and Turkey and Russia. And I don't really think anybody's looking forward to those guys as like the arbiters of shit going on in Bosnia. So that's what really has everybody sort of scared. It's more of an internal collapse rather than an explosion that we saw in the 90s.
Right, but there are some kind of more militant groups, right? I'm not saying they're out in the streets with Kalashnikovs or anything, but I've seen some Orthodox groups. I believe they are armed, or at least they say they are. There's the kind of like murmurings of these groups already, or am I wrong?
No, there's definitely, look, there's guys with Kalashnikovs, you know, there's definitely dudes with guns. There's a lot of gangsters. There is disaffected youth that can't get up to Europe, let's say, or don't for whatever reason. You know, when I say that everybody's left, we're talking 40, 50%. There's still going to be a lot of people around. And, you know, these are going to be even people from poor economic circumstances. One guy told me that you can easily cause problems because it'd take like 300 euros to get some kids to throw some Molotov cocktails. But one thing about the place is that it's super small and everybody knows each other. And the security services, particularly in Bosnia, they have a lot of experience with, you know, they had a little Al-Qaeda problem, right? You know, in the late 90s and just around September 11th, they'd had thousands of Mujahideen, essentially fighters that turned out to be Al-Qaeda later, had gone to fight in the Bosnian Civil War. Some of them stayed, so they had a lot of experience dealing with those guys and keeping an eye on them. And then after September 11th, if anybody's paid any attention to the Bosnian Federation, it's Western intelligence making sure that they can keep an eye on these guys. They had a few hundred dudes go off to fight in Syria, and some of them have come back. So when I've talked to cops there, they don't really worry too much about that type of internal small groups of guys. If there's a group of like, you know, armed Serb dudes who might be willing to do violence on the Bosnian side, they know who those guys are right now. Now, the big problem is as things deteriorate, you start being unable to keep an eye on them. And then maybe those dudes link up with what we're afraid of is that the Serbs in Banja Luka, who are part of this federal system of Bosnia, have started talking about moving to pull their people out of the army and out of the security forces and even out of the court system. And so then you start getting into things where the only major institutions that people think of as just Bosnian at this stage would be like the court system and the army. So he's pulling out of those. A guy I talked to, a survivor of Srebrenica, he told me, okay, so the Bosnian Serbs want to pull out of the Bosnian army, which is like it's a tiny little organization, but it's, a functioning multi-sectarian group. And they want to pull this out and start their own Bosnian Serb army. And he was like, so what's the doctrine of a Bosnian Serb army? He's like, killing my family. He's like, if they get their own army, I'm going to pick up a gun.
Yeah.
So we see that stuff. But when I compare it to the 90s, I mean, there's a million less teenagers and tanks and mortars and heavy artillery and stuff. But there is a possibility of small scale violence, and certainly people on the outside instigating that, people wanting to come in from Serbia, Hungary, Turkey, wherever. There's a lot of possibility there because the central state itself is so weak. So I'm alarmed about the security situation in Bosnia, and a lot of people are. But when we talk about what might happen, it's not going to look like the 1990s.
Right, but it could very well spiral out of control. Why is it then that the Serbs are so desperate to secede from Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Well, this is an interesting thing. Most Serbs aren't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, it becomes a little more cynical than that. I think that, I haven't talked to many, if any, Bosnian Serbs who particularly feel like there's a major problem with the system. It seems to be the major problem everybody has with the system is the same across the board, from what I can tell, among most Bosnians. Although you will find some radicals on each side. People are sick of corruption. They're sick of no investment, no industry. They're tired of having to get, watching their natural resources and oligarchs from, all the different religions. Nobody's innocent on this stuff, pillaging this tiny country that was already pretty poor to begin with, and was recovering from a war. But when you get to the political end, it's because of this created system where everybody has to vote for their boss. It ends up sort of being like Lebanon, and there's other countries that have had this, where you sort of have a democracy, but the democracy is dominated by Catholics have to vote for their dude because they won't get jobs and patronage networks.
Right.
And so half the people who go out and vote for, and Dodik himself is fairly authoritarian, does not really like elections, and nobody's given him that tough of a time about how undemocratic his system has become inside the Republic of Srpska. I've seen polling that puts him at about 35% among support from the Serbs. But he is in charge, and he's in charge of the money, and he's in charge, and he's in charge of the security services. The guy's an autocrat. Now, why is he pushing? Again, he hasn't come out and said that he wants to secede. That would be a bright line. He said he's willing to consider it. Right. But what he wants is these reforms. But if you look at what the reforms do, they essentially gut the idea of a Bosnia, federal entity. That the idea that this country is going to have one foreign policy, one security forces, one court system, and then maybe some sectarian local government to keep everybody happy. That's not what he's clearly trying to destroy that Dayton experiment.
So he wants to balkanize within the balkanized zone.
Exactly. And honestly, there's a lot of theories about it. And I don't want to sound like I'm editorializing too much, but they're pretty compelling. Yeah. I spent all of December asking people, what does Dodik really want? And there's a lot of different theories, but they kind of boil down to some themes. And there's some themes that we actually see pretty commonly with autocrats once they've managed to cling to power for more than a decade or so, which is that, you start thinking you can't leave. And that, one of the most popular reasonable theories, some of the theories involve cocaine and orgies. So I don't know, I'm joking, but I'm also not joking.
Yeah.
I've been also told there's questions about his mental health. There's questions about that he didn't used to be a heavy drinker, but people have wondered if he's become one, that type of thing. Like, that's how irrational his behavior has been, that it's led to some speculation across Sarajevo and Banja Luka about what the dude's problem is. But the thing that people kept coming back to was that he might understand, or he might have made a decision that he's basically stolen so much and made so many enemies that he won't be able to sleep at night if he's not in charge of the Republic of Srpska. And if that means gutting the place and turning it into Transnistria or Ossetia or some version of it, like a dead little country that nobody really cares about, he might be willing to do that because he might be convinced that he's going to get killed for stuff. Like, he's really pissed off. There's, these guys are gangsters. There's a lot of internal money sloshing around, getting stolen by guys like him. He's got rivals that probably would surprise us because you'd think they'd be nationalist Serbian politicians. And it turns out they're all right. You know what I mean? They're mobsters that hate each other. Yeah. There's a lot of that in that area. And so as a result, he might have himself convinced that he would be either convicted and sent to jail for widespread corruption, that he might be the target of retribution by people he's pissed off over the years, and that he's made a decision that he'd rather burn the whole thing down than take that chance. I don't know. There's another theory, which I think we can really subscribe to, that might be part of that, which is no matter what his individual thinking is, the reason why he's been getting away with this is it's two really easy to understand things. For 10 years, they strang the Western Balkans along, telling them that they'd be part of the EU. And then once they let in Croatia in the 2008 economic crisis hit and the Greek thing happened, all of a sudden they didn't let anybody else in. And everybody knows that, which really empowered all the scumbag politicians on every side, because they knew now this was their chance, to stay in, that they weren't going to get kicked out for like proper Brussels technocrats or whatever. And the second thing is just the lack of interest by the US and NATO in the peacekeeping mission in Bosnia. There's been a lot of stuff, that people have mentioned to me that all the US would have to do is send like a platoon of the 82nd Airborne and mention they're paying attention, and that like people, but and I don't know whether that's an exaggeration, but somebody literally told me that. And then everybody would back down because in the end, these guys are all really small-time bullies in a small country, as you said, the Balkanization of the Balkans. So you're talking about a guy who, is popular, 30% popular among 1 million people who live in the Republic of Srpska isn't like, Putin or anything. But we haven't, or we, when I say we, I mean the West, NATO, the US, the people that originally were the backers and architects of Dayton, there hasn't been really a lot of interest in stepping up. And this was really exacerbated by the Trump administration, where we had free range, doofus ambassadors running around trying to do peace deals or cut the other kinds of weird, like lobbying deals and stuff like that in Kosovo and Serbia. And so I think that emboldened a lot of like bad guys on all sides. I'm not taking any political side, whether you're Croat, Bosnian, or Muslim, or Croat, Bosnian, or Serbian. Most of your politicians are pretty much scumbags. These guys all saw incompetence from the US during that time, and I think it emboldened them further. So in a way, it's a perfect storm. And then you throw in Russia, which is its whole separate.
Yeah. How serious is the sectarian divide there in the midst of all this?
Everybody talks about how it never used to be like this.
Yeah.
And they seem really sad when they say it. It depends on where you go. I think, I know Serbs who, admittedly, they're liberal, who live in Sarajevo and don't really have a problem. They might occasionally overhear two Muslims in the market talking about how all Serbs suck or something like that. But, but there are definitely still mixed areas. I don't think there's violence. What I think, in that regard, there's just a lot of distrust, as let's say the guy who's a survivor of Srebrenica told me, he still sees the people who killed his family.
So it's more, there's tolerance. There's tolerance still.
Right. There's definitely tolerance for that stuff among the individual people, but it's pretty thin ice, you're still looking at the people that you think murdered your family. you're seeing them at the market, and one of them's a cop,
Yeah,
and
that's never
so
going away.
like, right, like at least not this generation. This guy survived Trebrenica, you know what I mean? Like, but what I mean is, I think they're all able to do it. But once you start teetering the overall, structure, which I think a combination of these factors have. I think disinterest from NATO, getting the rug pulled out of them by the EU, US acting bonkers for the last 5 years and not really paying any attention or securing a lot of people's, political, backing people politically who are trying to do a good job. There hasn't been enough of any of that stuff. And then what you also see coming in, though, is the people who are paying attention to the region have a tendency to have kind of sectarian or geopolitical goals that might not be in Bosnia's best interest. You see Turkey is extremely active there, both in terms of economics and intelligence. Vucic over in Serbia. Those guys, obviously, I mean, Vucic has fairly good relationships with the government in Sarajevo, believe it or not. Meaning the Bosniak government in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
And with the federal government, it's always a little tense, but like they're working on highway projects together and things like that. Some of the countries that are paying attention here aren't necessarily great guys. Serbia has a lot of interest all over the place. And what's funny is the Serbs in Belgrade, they're not exactly supporting Dodik's.
No, there's a lot of, especially the younger generation, are really fucking sick of him. I mean, we saw very serious clashes last year there.
Oh, yeah. No, in terms of the young generation, absolutely. But even when you get up to the top end politically, like if you were to grab Vucic, president of Serbia, and ask him, hey, man, do you want the Republic of Srpska? He'd be like, no. Yeah. Okay, I want 1.2 million people who are poor and even more aggro than the guys I already have to deal with. No, forget it. And that I honestly think that, but at the same time, he's a pretty Machiavellian guy, or whatever the cliche is, and seems pretty adept at playing the West off against the Russians without really committing to either side. The man is certainly walking a tightrope over Ukraine right now, where he's got the only population like Europe that's completely supportive of Russia, but at the same time doesn't want to alienate NATO or the EU.
Yeah.
So he's a super careful guy. And, Dodik is over here knocking over the apple cart, which is part of why we wonder if, there's a real personal motivation for him to be doing this, or a very, let's say, local political motivation to doing this, because it doesn't feel like this is something that's being orchestrated from Belgrade. But where it might be orchestrated a little bit from, at least until a month or so ago, was Moscow, where Putin has certainly been how do we put this? A lot of what, everybody talks about Kosovo as being a moment where Putin just really couldn't get over it. What he saw with Serbia getting bombed, and he realized the West was out to get him. He has just as much interest in wrecking Dayton as that. And so there is a belief that whenever there's a belief, at least, because we do not get readouts from these meetings, but like when I was in Sarajevo at one point, Dodik went to Moscow and met with Putin and announced that he met with Putin, and then Putin didn't really acknowledge the meeting. And then they admitted there was a meeting, but they didn't give us a readout of what they talked about. And you could tell, like, what he was doing was going, okay, how much do you have my back on this situation? I'm not sure how much I can trust Belgrade. And so we've seen a lot of Russian intelligence operations in the past few years starting to pop up, and they're pretty clumsy and identifiable, but it also shows that, like, the GRU and the FSB have certainly paid attention in some ways, I think more than NATO certainly has, to the situation both in Serbia and Kosovo and in Bosnia. You've seen, like, there's a cultural center now in a Serbian city right by the border run by the Russians, and Dodik, even the Bosnian Serbs now say, instead of cooperating with NATO on the training of their police, they're going to send their police to this place to get trained by the Russians. I've been told that center is just obviously it might also be a friendship center, but it's also obviously an intelligence setup.
Of course.
It's right by the NATO bases. And it's sort of famous. And so there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a disputed, if there was to be widespread violence in Bosnia or any kind of serious violence in Bosnia, there's a section called Brčko, which is sort of its own little autonomous section. If you go basically straight up from Sarajevo. And what it does is it's an ethnically mixed area that could cut off the two main sections of the Republika Srpska if they tried to secede. So there's like a postage stamp in the land bridge that connects Belgrade and Banja Luka, if that makes sense. You can look it up on a map.
Yeah.
And that area is the area where most people would expect there to be some violence if there was, because whoever controls Brčko can cut Banja Luka off from Belgrade. Right. And so it's a mixed area. I didn't explain this earlier because it's just so intensively complicated, but it's actually administered under its own process because it's so complicated compared to the rest of Bosnia. So that's an area where we'd be concerned about there being violence. It's considered very strategic. And local reporters have a list of the ongoing obvious Russian intelligence operations just in Brčko. Like, and they're so clumsy that like all the local reporters are like, hey, look, the Russian intelligence guys are like driving around with a van, giving out leaflets, that type of thing. It's not super secret, but there's an ongoing list where the Balkan Insight and these guys who do a great job reporting.
Yeah,
they've been following it. Yeah, and they've been following this stuff up there, and it's all just blatant. But the problem is, as much as we laugh at the incompetent Russians driving around in a van, handing out flyers to people, telling them Russia's their friend, the one message it does show is that at least Russia gives a crap. Whereas I do believe part of the issue for the security of the Balkans is this widespread perception that NATO and the EU don't give a crap.
Yeah, of course.
And that's dangerous right now. That's maybe the most dangerous thing that's going. I don't think Dodik does this on any level if the West had been, or if Europe and the EU had been paying attention last few years.
No, I mean, the EU and Europe doesn't give a shit about the Balkans. You go there, it's drastically clear. In terms of kind of opposition to Dodik, what is there?
Look, the Serbs have a pretty vibrant political system. There are people who oppose him, and Serbs, of course, are going to be Serbian about stuff. And I don't want to criticize them for that. They've got their own take and their own history and their own politics. So even some of the guys that you might consider to be, good partners in Bosnia might have some opinions that would, not shock, but, just that they have a tendency to see it that way. But there are people that appear to want to work with the system. But I don't want to name names, but I've talked to a bunch of them because I'd rather them explain it. That, it's a political issue. It's a political opinion that I'm expressing of someone else's. But when I've talked to opposition Bosnian Serb politicians, and these are the good guys who want to integrate and they want to run things and have a nice technocratic, normal democracy. Everything they want to join the EU. Like they're unrealistic about installing that kind of system themselves on their own.
Bosnia as a whole.
And so, yeah, if you think about it, like if you want to reform, do you want to reform Banja Luka's judiciary, on your own as a Serb, or do you want the help of the European Union under like an umbrella of sort of protection? Because a lot of people have a lot of vested interest in not reforming anything. And they're mafias. They will kill you to an extent, although, once they get overwhelmed and go away. But like the first time a prosecutor walks out and starts trying to really clean up Bosnian politics, I don't know. I talked with a guy who told me that the U.S. funds a corruption program, and it's considered pretty good, except that the cop that told me about it mentioned that the people in charge of it are actually really honest. But the thing is, and they come out with these files all the time. They actually do proper investigations. They collect a bunch of evidence, and then they turn them over to the investigating committee of the parliament. And nothing ever happens. So everybody gets to feel like it's investigated, but then when they investigate it, they realize, the people who are propping up the peace treaty,
there's
no the people you'd have to indict, right? The people you'd have to indict, but it's a catch-22.
Well, it's a similar thing happens in Kosovo, actually, on the other side of things, where NATO and the EU is like, just let them do what they want, so long as they're kind of on our side.
Yeah, everybody does that.
Yeah.
Look, if you're not actively trying to burn the place down, and I mean literally with a bucket of benzene, You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to come to your house and tell you to knock it off right. And, I don't want to get into the politics around the EU and the special representative. It's all incredibly complicated. I don't know enough about that side of the politics to do it on a podcast by any means. But I would point out that there is somebody who's appointed by the EU who can rule by fiat still, for the most part.
Mm.
So there's supposed to be a technocrat at the top of the system who can just replace Dodik. Do you know what I mean? So what ends up happening is when they don't, granted, you can see why they would not find that a politically genius idea right now. I don't, you know what I mean? I get why they don't do it. But the problem with that type of system is, and as somebody, as an American who follows American foreign policy quite a lot in my career, there is this weird phenomenon that happens where if you have the power to remove somebody and decide that's not a brilliant idea, you're kind of responsible for all the crimes they did and that they do later. Mm. And so, or at least you look like a eunuch. So what ends up happening is, and this doesn't apply just to Dodik, it can apply to all of the different, all of the different government structures of Bosnia. They're all pretty corrupt. Is these people can be replaced by the EU or by this commissioner. So if they're not, that's an implicit endorsement.
If you close your eyes, it's still happening, right?
Right. But basically what you're telling the Bosnian people is that, we know that guy's corrupt and we can fire him, but we haven't.
Yeah. yeah. Sorry.
But the thing is, and in some cases, I get why they don't. This is incredibly complicated stuff. And I'd also point out, nobody's ever successfully done something like this before. I think we failed to get this when we look at places like Iraq. And maybe that's why you just shouldn't invade countries in the first place.
Yeah, probably.
But you know what I mean? But there's not a great template for how to fix a place like the former Yugoslavia. But so I understand when you're like, we can't just remove every local politician who's a bad guy. The Bosnians are all really intelligent, educated people who know a hell of a lot about how all this works. So the message they take away is, but you didn't fire them.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening in my, and this is, I guess, the most I'll editorialize here, is that there's definitely a problem where on one hand, and you see this a lot in occupations and trying to get rid of civil wars and invasions, is you end up working with people that you think are essential to getting the mission done. In this case, the original mission was to get everybody to stop killing each other, and stop genocides. And, people would argue it's more complicated than that, but let's just say in good faith, the point was to stop everybody from killing each other in 1995. So everybody was willing to go along with having to work with some questionable people to do that. Mm. But then what ends up happening is, so those people are the foundation of your peace deal, but they're also the ones that are going to keep your peace deal from ever turning into a proper country and peace.
It's exactly what happened in Kosovo. You end up with people that there's evidence that they're serious war criminals, end up in the government. And because of this, like you said, the peace deal that the West has made and helped them with or whatever, they kind of have to be like, well, we're going to have to actually not care about all those things we said we care about and just let this guy carry on.
Also, if you take him out, the fighting might start.
Yeah, exactly.
If you take him out, the fighting might start back up again, man. His people aren't going to just let that go.
But there's only so much time that can stay there, right? And now we see, like we're seeing in Bosnia, I think this is kind of a result of that kind of policy.
I think so, and I think you'll see it in Kosovo. And to be honest, this is I covered Afghanistan at least the first decade.
Yeah,
I didn't cover Afghanistan the second decade, kind of because nobody wanted me to, and I kind of knew how it would end.
Yeah,
but it was the same situation as when the U.S. came in. They immediately got into bed with all these absolutely terrible warlords. And they said, we need these warlords because they're the ones who can help us fight Al-Qaeda, which was true. But then everybody was like, but your warlords are why there'll never be a democracy in Afghanistan. And everybody was like, man, we'll let the next administration figure that out.
Yeah.
Because my job right now is to protect America from Al-Qaeda attacks. So I'm going to go kill Al-Qaeda guys, and these guys are going to help me kill Al-Qaeda guys. Right. And these guys are going to help me kill Al Qaeda guys. And then, like, the next administration can hope maybe they all become nicer people or they get voted out in an election. And, if you talk to the Afghans, I don't want to oversimplify. We're not talking about that. I don't want to oversimplify what happened there. But one of the watershed moments was when, the whole international community got together. And I don't think anybody was unhappy Karzai got put in, in the job at the time. It was considered a pretty good move. But then underneath Karzai, they were going to let Dostum and Marshal Fahim and all of these dudes who were absolutely not better than the Taliban. They were just pro-American. And so the fact that those warlords were there, and if you see, they're the very same warlords that kept the place miserable under U.S. occupation. And then the minute the U.S. left, they're essentially the people that got overthrown.
Yeah.
So, I have this a version of this concern. That's obviously a very complicated, dramatic situation. But who you let stay in power, if you can remove them, really sends a message to the ordinary people. And in this case, I think the people of Bosnia are pretty cynical about the best interest, how the rest of the world views them. I don't think they've got a paranoid thing that the world's out to get them. I think that they just recognize nobody really cares.
Yeah, and they must be sick of being this kind of ping pong ball between different sides, right?
Yeah, there are a bunch of people who are just trying to get things done every day, like the rest of us. It's they're just small, poor European country, but I think that's also something that hurts them but helps them. Again, is that you see voters tend to vote with their feet, and the Bosnians have essentially the people who should be building the country and their best and their brightest are living in Sweden and Austria and Germany. I mean, that's not to shit on the people who are still in Bosnia. They'll tell you the same thing. Is for the most part, if you can get out, and most people can get out if you're educated, at least they do. And so you also see a brain drain of talent. Yeah. It's a talent drain. It's also just a good people drain. These are the people who are, a lot of these countries, what they really need is, besides rule of law, is like a middle class, because rich people can always get around bad services. Poor people, nobody ever listens to about bad services. But when you've got a middle, people start, complaining about the water and the roads, and, you have to take them seriously. That middle class is really hard to develop in any country, but it's even harder when they're just an hour flight from a decent job in Vienna. People just decide to go, and I don't blame them.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you give us a kind of brief idea of how Bosnia came to be what it is now? Maybe just explaining the kind of the conflict and what led to what is now, Bosnia Herzegovina.
Yeah, well, it's a really fascinating history, but basically in this, what they call the Western Balkans or the Balkans, as Yugoslavia was formed, it basically formed in the aftermath of World War I. I mean, obviously, people would dispute certain stuff. It's Balkan history. But they managed to lump together, three different religions sort of where they meet in the Balkans. And they all have this history with one another. There's been kingdoms of Serbs. There's been Bosnian kingdoms. The tribes of the Southern Slavs have gone back and forth. But when, at some point the Turks invaded and occupied parts of it for, hundreds and hundreds of years and withdrew. So because of its meeting, sort of spot of different cultures, it was always considered very strategic ground and always very much fought over. So when Yugoslavia formed, it had to form in a bunch of sort of disparate elements that hadn't really lived together under one rule by themselves before. And that would be like, Croats who are more or less Catholic, Bosniaks who are Muslims, sort of remnants of the Turkish occupation, even though they aren't Turks, they're South Slavs themselves. And then, obviously the Eastern Orthodox Serbs. And so they kind of got all stuck together under Yugoslavia, and it worked pretty well because it was socialism and it was ruled by Tito. So everybody got fairly well educated. Nobody starved. They did a really effective job of playing the East and West against each other and working with the non-aligned countries. Basically, like Yugoslavia at times in the Cold War did extremely well for itself because they could go build the dams in Algeria, but also do deals with the Americans. It was a good spot for them. So they built a nice middle class in the 60s and 70s. But as the thing fell apart, because it was all really being run by one guy or a core of guys left over from World War II, it started to break apart, and it started to break apart in ways that you can immediately identify if you listen to, say, Donald Trump's speech on January 6th. Nationalist politicians started giving these, speeches about how the real problem with how things are is because everybody's out to get you. And it turns out it's your neighbors and you can't trust them. And so these countries, started splitting up, and you saw minor stuff in Slovenia. That was the first one to go. And they had about a week worth of war where a few dozen people were killed. But, Yugoslavia had to let them go. They were the closest to Europe. Had much closer cultural ties, I think, in a lot of ways to Germany and Austria than they did to Serbia or Macedonia. But then Croatia started to go. And when Croatia and Bosnia started to really break up, these were two places that had significant populations of Serbs, or in the case of Bosnia, significant populations of both Serbs and Croats on top of the Bosniaks. And so that's where the wars broke out. Is people, where these groups touch. This is why Serbia itself, until Kosovo decided to leave, didn't really get involved. It was fighting between neighbors in areas where people saw an opportunity to expand their political or ethnic or religious groups, influence. And so it turned into neighbor on neighbor stuff. And it led to a terrible civil war that ranged across multiple countries throughout much of the 90s, killed way over 100,000 people. Displaced the most we've seen. Well, I guess Ukraine's replaced it, but the most that anybody's seen in Europe since World War II. And fixing it was really hard because it turned into it was just a straight up sectarian political knife fight like you would see in Lebanon or, a couple of different other countries where you have three different religious groups vying for supremacy. And that's what happened to Bosnia. But on top of it were all these Bosnians who, this is the sad part is, and this is my shout out to all the people that believe in this stuff. Bosnia is, mostly filled with people who'd originally bought into the whole idea of Yugoslavia and everybody living together, right, and had done a good job, And so the saddest thing because we're about to come up on the 30th anniversary of this happening, was in April of 1992. Despite what had already happened in Slovenia and the terrible war that was raging next door in Croatia between the Serbs and the Croats, the Bosnians were absolutely convinced it wouldn't happen, that it couldn't happen to them, it couldn't happen in their place, that they'd lived and intermarried with the Serbs and the Croats for so long that they transcended this type of tribal background. And, obviously it was naive socialism or just human nature. Yeah. And they held a peace rally, and the peace rally got shot up by Serb snipers. And that's the day the war started. But you still find all of these people who will just say, if you ask them, they're Bosnians. They're not a Bosnian Muslim or a Croat or a Serb. They know that they're attacked as part of that community because everything in the political system reminds them of it all day. But they want to be Bosnian, just like they wanted to be Yugoslav. Yeah. Yeah, most people do, in my experience. I think even if you go, even when you go into the Serbian areas, there's a lot more distrust. It's hard to talk to Serbs about some of this stuff in a good manner because, they feel a little victimized and they feel like everybody's made up their minds about them. That they were the ones that did all the genocides and that they were the ones that were the aggressors. And, some of that is very true. But also at times, they were also victims. And there was plenty of Serbs who, did believe in Bosnia or didn't believe in in this stuff. It's all very complicated. So there's a suspicion of the international community. So you might hear that a little bit less from a Serb.
I mean, NATO also bombed them to shit as well, right? I know on one level, okay, they were stopping a genocide, but if you look into it, they did actually start just bombing hospitals, bombing civilians.
Well, okay, this is two different times.
Sure, but they still, it's part of their culture, right? They're kind of...
Well, it's two different mentalities. The Bosnian Serbs are definitely still pissy about how they were treated, and how they're thought of after the Civil War. But then when you go over to Serbia, it's actually, it's a different thing. Is they're a little annoyed that they're tagged with being responsible for what the Bosnian Serbs did. Right. Because most of them think of them as their crazy cousins, they don't, not most, you know what I mean? It's as you see there's Antifa all over, and different groups all over Belgrade who hate nationalism and stuff like that. Absolutely. But getting bombed by the West was a huge psychological blow. and a huge psychological moment for every Serb I know, no matter what your political affiliation. Yeah. The idea that NATO was going to bomb Belgrade, that blew up your TV station. Like, a friend of mine works in that building. And actually, one day I went to visit him for work, and I didn't even realize, I hadn't even made the connection. He was like, hey, I got to show you something. And we walked around the thing, opened the door, and went into like the blown out studio. It's right there still in the building. And I was like, shit. He was like, yeah, we got to show this to every American who comes through. I'm sorry, man. And I was like, no, I needed to see it. It's good. You know what I mean? But like, you had to take that moment where you're like, yeah, we blew this guy's like TV studio up. And so that is one of the reasons why you're automatically seeing some knee-jerk reactions from Serbs who are just distrustful that the West will turn on you when they thought they were part of it, you know, or whatever. And so it's really tough. It's a complicated place, and it's got such a long history. You know, I'm not trying to do the Bart Simpson land of contrasts thing, but like it's a really long, complicated part of the world with a lot of history, because it's been overlapped by so many different empires. But I find it fascinating, and I mean, I love the place. I love all of the countries equally in some ways, but Bosnia is one of my favorite places to work, and I really hope these poor people don't end up screwed.
Yeah, I love the Balkans in general, man. Anytime I've been there, I've just absolutely loved it. Like, people are great, very kind of fun, you know what I mean? Very kind of clued in. Where do you think the most significant thing going ahead is then for Bosnia? What's the kind of, what do we need to keep our eyes on ahead now?
Look, before what happened in Ukraine, I would have said, you know, the next few months and then the run up to the elections. And I think that in October, and that if they manage to get through the elections and come up with a government and people pay a little bit more attention to them, and Dodik doesn't do some of the most extreme things he's hinted he would do, then, you know, I think they might be in okay shape, but getting there would be really hard. The problem with predicting is I think that the deck has really been reshuffled with Ukraine.
Massively, yeah.
And I'm not sure how that's going to play out yet. Like, there's a scenario in which I can see Putin's adventurism in the Balkans is now over for the most part, and that there had been a lot of Russian sort of shenanigans. I mean, they claim it was just straight intelligence work, and I guess it is from their perspective, but they had been doing a lot of different operations in the Balkans. They were certainly willing to, you know, interested in seeing NATO and the EU embarrassed by what happens in Bosnia, just like they're very interested in seeing them embarrassed by what happens in Kosovo. And so I don't know that those are the highest national security priorities for them, but I think they're priorities. And that stuff really might be interrupted. I think it might be harder to get people to work for you now if you're a Russian intelligence officer. I think budgets might be a little tougher. You know, there's going to be fewer people at the embassies. So it's possible this is something that's going to buy Bosnia a little bit of time to get through some reforms and some elections without any Russian interference. But the flip side of that is that there's a huge land war raging just a couple of countries over. And I'm not sure that like a major war in the Slavic world is going to be the thing that calms Bosnia down. So I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out what this means.
All right, mate. I've got to go, but where can people follow your work if they want to?
Yeah, Mitch Prothero at Twitter.
All right, man. Thanks. Speak soon.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was journalist Mitchell Prothero talking to us about the possibility of reignited violence in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the Balkans, something that obviously nobody wants to see, but something that's very underreported and worth keeping an eye on. If you like what we do here at Popular Front, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront or popularfront.co/support. Also, right now we have a new documentary out on our YouTube, youtube.com/popularfront. It's a documentary covering the largely underreported youth uprising, if you like, in Corsica. If you didn't know, that is a small island off the coast of Italy and France. It's under the control of the French, so it's part of France, but a lot of people on the island for a long time now have not wanted to be a part of France. They either want independence or autonomy. A Corsican political prisoner, Ivan Colonna, was beaten up in a prison in France and he died recently, and the youth are very angry about that, as are a lot of other people. To understand what's going on there, go and watch our documentary. Again, youtube.com/popularfront. Please do share it if you like it and show people what is going on there. Thank you to our sponsors, Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 South West Bond Avenue, 97239. They will probably give you a cheap or free coffee if you tell them Popular Front sent you. They might not, I don't know, but yeah, check them out. Also, thank you to Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grindcore House. Go and visit them. The shop looks really, really fucking cool. Check them out, Grindcore House. Also, thank you to Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use the promo code POPULARFRONT10 for 10% off. Thank you very much to them. Follow us on socials, Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_. All my socials are at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN. YouTube, youtube.com/popularfront. For everything, just go to the website popularfront.co. You'll find everything there, links all over the place. There's merch as well, popularfront.shop. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black. Listen to his music at samblackpf.com. Thank you very much to our high tier Patreons. Now, a lot of people have messaged me saying you didn't read my name out. I didn't mean to. I've noticed there's a real... Patreon is very, very buggy. It always has been. They keep saying they're fixing it. They never really do. The app is absolute chaos. It doesn't work properly. And for some reason, the parameters I put in to get everybody's name up has not been working properly. So if I've missed you out, let me know and I will write it down. It's a massive, massive neck ache, but it is what it is. Anyway, thank you to Alex Harvey. Fucking hell. Q loves cake farts. Nicholas Blomberg, Matthew Diffley, Matthew Mendoza, Noah Schmidt, Lisa, Jane Milichip, Claire, Liana, Gavin Thornton, Sean, Christianovich, I think that's how you pronounce that, NTHG, Ethan Zwick, Champagne Anarchist, Thwat, Elise Middlefart, David McManus, Joaquim Williamson Holt, Idoye Travis, Ikta K, I hope I said that right, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Kate, Lisa Milgram, Bradley Davies, Brendan Crave, B, Drift, Pete Hesher, RX, Travis Lieberman, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, Shikha Gupta, I think that's right, please tell me if it's not, LD50 Seattle, K Glitter Vulcan, Meredith Waters, Bethany Swoveland, Adam H, Ryan Barbadillo, Derivative Fool, Larson 8669, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Zach Packard, Todd Cravens, TFD, Nicholas Butter, JD, Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Shanklin the Painter, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Mike Barone, Ben, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, Wizard of Woz, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Nate Van Dor, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Stephen Davila, Anthony Kabarak, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did, Chester Watts, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock and Maurice Zumbul. I think that should be all the names actually. I noticed there's more this time, so hopefully the new parameters I put in, which were exactly the same as the old ones, has actually made all the names come up. If not, please do let me know. Thanks for supporting as always. We're doing a lot already this year and we're going to do a lot more. Support us, patreon.com/popularfront. There's loads of extra content there. Cheers.